Let's introduce the classical era with Prelude 4 in the next unit. Music as order and logic. Take a quick look at this ancient Greek architecture. This is the Parthenon in Athens, and this gives you a little visual picture of the ideas that really embodied the classical era. Classicism, or the classical era, dated from around 1750, so that was the end of the Baroque period, into the 19th century, 1825. So the first part of the 18th century was considered the classical era. The romantic era came in, kind of blended that. For the last, I would say from about 1815 to 25, it was a bit of a blend between classicism and romanticism. But that gives you an idea of about a span of roughly about 75 years. The rule of aristocrats was still very strong. People thought that if you were a king, you had hereditary rights. There were certain rights that belonged just to kings, and that was how society was set up. Louis XV, Frederick the Great, Maria Theresa, and Catherine the Great are all names you may be familiar with around that time. So, really, still had some strong aristocratic sovereigns that were considered, the end all be all. Also, during this time, if you think about in America, the Industrial Revolution was really kicking off, and that brought with it significant advances in science, important inventions. That also influenced intellectual life and even the first publication of encyclopedias, which means that more people were getting more knowledge and a wider variety of knowledge. The change of social structure was happening based on the Industrial Revolution changing things. Economic power was changing. So there were a lot of things happening here. And it was nicknamed or called the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment Age. And what that is referring to is how people approached social and political issues, how they thought, their way of thinking, even how philosophers thought. They approached things not with emotion anymore, like the Baroque, but with reason and science. The idea of prove it to me, prove it to me. I want to see how and why. Philosophers were starting to really advocate for the rising middle class so that there was less of this all power in the sovereignty. And there were some major revolutionary upheavals, not even just the American Revolutionary War, but there were a lot of different revolutions happening at the end of the century, if you want to look into history. Still are looking back to these ancient Greeks and Romans, still idolizing them, their architecture, their fine arts. And so there was a classical revival of those styles because the value that they placed on order and reason was very obvious, just like we saw in the Parthenon. They revered or respected unity and proportions in their artwork and clarity, structure, natural simplicity. These are things that describe what was happening across all the arts, but we are for sure going to hear that tendency in music as well. Regularity of structure, clarity, clearness, order, reason. Okay, so virtuosity is going to die down a little bit. All this fanciful stuff and more orderly music, if that makes sense. Classical music, as you might know it, obviously is going to have its roots right here in the classical era. It's going to sound very orderly, for lack of a better word. A little after the mid 18th century, there were some emerging romantic views. I want you to become familiar with a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a French philosopher. He was actually considered the father of Romanticism, which is the next section we're going to talk about, in the next unit after classicism. And there was also a movement called the Sturm und Drang literary movement in Germany. And those were hints at the romantic view, which was a little bit darker, a little bit more emotional, but in a different way than the Baroque approach to emotion. Here is Thomas Jefferson's design for his rotunda at the University of Virginia, right after the Parthenon style with those columns. There was a written French encyclopedia, and this was not our traditional thinking of like Britannica. but this was a collection of writings. And what it did was it collected writings from all sorts of different philosophers and authors and tried to gather knowledge from all over the world. So this was very popular during this time. Musically speaking, we're going to look at the music of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. Schubert may sneak in there, but he's more associated with the Romantic era. This was an age of musical experimentation, exploring the major minor system, and this fit perfectly well with the large scale instrumental form, which we'll talk about, called sonata form. The elements of the style would be a very melodic, lyrical, elegant melody, which was very symmetrical, very clear cut. Remember, order is the name of the game here. Repetition and sequence was used commonly, which helped balance the structure. A lot of homophonic texture and diatonic harmonies. Very steady tempos with basic meters, nothing too fancy. And they started bringing in folk and popular elements into the music, which really brought in some of that middle class as well. This is a picture of a minuet dance, which was a popular dance in the 18th century. Picture of a painting of them, but you can kind of see the dresses and the clothing to kind of give you a frame of reference for the time period. A lot of music making was done at home, and this is what this shows, a typical violin piano duo. And that was very common at home to be able to have some entertainment. The patronage system was a system of aristocracy, and basically what the main thinking was that you had to have music. It was necessary. It was necessary to make you feel and look important and to establish that elaborate lifestyle. So the palace became the center of musical life, and they would hire musicians that would be in their employment. And much like in the Baroque, there was a steady demand for music and a steady demand for new works. And so it became very important to have these forms that musicians could plug the notes into and basically crank out music very quickly for all of these different occasions. There were more opportunities for women that emerged in both the ballets and the operas, sometimes even as music teachers or court instrumentalists, but for sure at home, that would have been a very popular thing. Almost everyone would have learned an instrument, female or male. That was very common. And Mozart, we're going to talk about coming up here, but there were a couple of keyboardists that were really associated with him. One was his sister, Nannerl, who toured with him. He was the child protege. We'll learn about him if you don't know about him. And also toured Europe with a friend named Maria Teresa von Paradis. And interestingly enough, she was blind. But she was a very important composer as well during that time. So you may come across those two names, which are nice to see some female names in the mix. There's a portrait of a singer from a French opera. Gives you an idea again of the styling and shows you that women were becoming more prominent. In the performance areas, we had more concert halls showing up, more public concerts showing up, and interestingly, as the orchestra grew, they needed conductors, which had never been needed before. But Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven all conducted and performed their own works. Audiences were very eager for new music, and there was a connection that was grown between this idea of a composer genius and a receptive listener. They really revered these composers, thought of them as very, very genius, very brilliant. The listeners adored them, but they had a relationship because obviously you need the listeners. If you're going to be writing music, you need someone to listen to it. So there was a mutual appreciation between them. Thank you.